April 21, 1945. The streets of a small Bavarian town lay silent under a grey morning sky, broken stones and shattered glass crunching beneath the boots of advancing American forces. In the cellar of a half-collapsed house on Hauptstrasse, 32-year-old Maria Hoffmann clutched her two daughters close, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of foreign voices and vehicle engines rumbling past overhead. She had been told by retreating German soldiers that the Americans would show no mercy, that occupying forces would bring chaos and suffering, that her family would face horrors beyond imagination. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Maria could not know, as she trembled in that cold basement, was that within hours, everything she had been taught to believe about the world would begin to crumble, and that the hand extended to save her family would come from a man she had been conditioned to fear most of all. The town of Rothenburg, population 3,200 before the conflict, had watched its young men march away in confident columns years earlier. Now in the spring of 1945, only the elderly women and children remained, hiding in whatever shelter they could find as the sounds of the final days of the European conflict drew near. Maria had not chosen to stay. Her husband, Klaus, a factory supervisor with no military training, had been conscripted in the desperate final months and sent eastward. She had received one letter in December, then silence. With two daughters, ages 7 and 4, and an elderly mother who could barely walk, fleeing was impossible. So they waited, subsisting on dwindling rations, burning furniture for warmth, and praying that somehow they would survive whatever came next. The propaganda had been relentless. For years, the German population had been told that enemy soldiers, particularly those from America, were brutal and uncivilized. The messages had been especially pointed regarding black soldiers, painting them as the most dangerous of all. Posters had shown caricatures designed to instill terror. Radio broadcasts had warned of atrocities. Teachers had reinforced these messages in schools. Maria, who had never traveled beyond her region, who had lived her entire life in the same small community, had no reason to doubt what she had been told. She had never met anyone who contradicted these narratives, never had access to information that challenged the official story. Fear was not an abstract concept in those final weeks. It was as real as the hunger gnawing at her stomach, as tangible as the cold seeping through her thin coat. It shaped every decision, every plan, every prayer. When the American forces entered Rothenburg that morning, they encountered no resistance. The town had been declared open to avoid destruction. Still, procedures had to be followed. Buildings needed to be cleared, civilians identified and registered, and any remaining threats neutralized. The task fell to various units of the 7th Army, which had been pushing through southern Germany since crossing the Rhine in March. Among these units was the 761st Tank Battalion, one of the few all-black armored units in the United States military at that time. Staff Sergeant James Thompson, age 28, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, had been with the 761st since its activation in 1942. He had trained for 2 years at Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, where he and his fellow soldiers had faced discrimination not just from the forces they would eventually fight, but from their own countrymen, who questioned whether black men should serve in combat roles at all. The 761st had proven themselves in engagement after engagement across France and into Germany, supporting infantry advances, working alongside white units who initially doubted them, and earning commendations that would be largely ignored by the military establishment of the time. Thompson carried the weight of constant proof on his shoulders, knowing that every action would be scrutinized, that every mistake would be attributed not to him as an individual, but to his entire race. He had seen fellow soldiers perform acts of extraordinary courage that went unrecognized. He had watched as white units with similar records received medals and recognition, while his battalion's achievements were minimized or forgotten. Yet he persisted, maintaining his standards not for recognition, but because his own sense of integrity demanded it. On that April morning, Thompson's squad was assigned to clear houses along a residential street that had sustained partial damage from artillery fire 2 days earlier. The protocols were clear. Knock, announce presence, enter carefully, identify all occupants, check for weapons or military personnel, provide basic assistance if needed, move to the next building. It was repetitive, exhausting work that required constant vigilance. Not every cellar held only civilians. Booby traps were a real concern. Desperate soldiers sometimes fought to the last. Caution was not optional. Thompson approached the damaged house on Hauptstrasse and knocked firmly on what remained of the front door, calling out in practiced German that American forces were present and that occupants should come out with hands visible. No response. He knocked again, louder, repeating the announcement. Still nothing. Protocol required entry. He gestured to Private Williams and Private Carter, and together they carefully pushed through the damaged entrance, weapons ready, senses heightened. The interior was dim, partially collapsed. Furniture lay overturned. Personal belongings were scattered across the floor, evidence of lives disrupted mid-motion. Then Thompson heard it, a small sound from below, a child's whimper, quickly muffled. He motioned for his squad to hold position and called down into the cellar in German. His accent heavy but words clear, that they meant no harm, that it was safe to come up, that food and medical help were available. For a long moment, nothing. Then slowly the sound of movement, a woman's voice, shaking, speaking too quickly for him to fully understand. He called down again, simpler words, patient tone. Maria's hands trembled as she helped her elderly mother up the cellar stairs. Her daughters clung to her skirt, faces buried against her legs. She had decided that remaining hidden was more dangerous than emerging, that if these soldiers intended violence, hiding would only delay it. Better to face whatever came with what little dignity she could muster. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the damaged roof, she saw 3 American soldiers, their weapons lowered but ready, watching her family carefully. And the one who had spoken to them, the one standing closest, was a black man. For a frozen moment, Maria's indoctrinated fears and her desperate reality collided. Every message she had absorbed told her to expect the worst. But the sergeant standing before her did not match the propaganda images. His expression was cautious but not hostile. His weapon pointed down. His stance, while alert, was not threatening. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a tone she had not expected to hear from any occupying soldier. Concern. Thompson saw a terrified woman, 2 small girls, and an elderly woman who could barely stand. He saw the same thing he had seen in a dozen other cellars across France and Germany, the human cost of conflict laid bare in hollow eyes and thin faces. He lowered his rifle completely, slinging it over his shoulder, and raised both hands in a universal gesture of peaceful intent. He asked in careful German if anyone was injured. Maria, voice barely above a whisper, said no, but that her mother needed medicine for her heart and had not had her medication in 3 weeks. The girls needed food. They were all so cold. What happened next would become the defining moment of Maria Hoffman's life, a moment she would recount decades later, with a clarity that time could not diminish. Thompson turned to Private Williams and spoke in English, asking him to get the medic and to bring food from their rations. Williams hesitated, pointing out that regulations limited aid to emergency medical situations and that their own supplies were meant for combat troops. Thompson's response was quiet, but firm. He said these people needed help, that they were no threat, and that there was enough to share. Williams nodded and left to retrieve the requested items. Thompson then did something that Maria would never forget. He removed his own jacket, a heavy field coat that provided real warmth, and approached the elderly woman carefully. He spoke directly to her, though she seemed barely conscious of her surroundings, explaining that he wanted to help her stay warm. Maria's mother, 73-year-old Gertrude Weber, looked up at the black soldier wrapping a coat around her shoulders with an expression of complete confusion, unable to reconcile this gentle action with everything she had been told to expect. Thompson then opened his pack and pulled out a chocolate bar, military issue, and offered it to the 2 girls. They looked to their mother, uncertain. Maria, tears now streaming down her face, nodded permission. The girls took the chocolate with trembling hands. The medic arrived, a white soldier from Ohio named Corporal Peterson, who examined Gertrude with professional efficiency. He reported that her blood pressure was dangerously high, that she was severely malnourished, and that without proper medication she was at serious risk. Thompson asked what could be done. Peterson explained that the battalion aid station was set up 3 streets over, that they had some cardiac medications from German supplies they had secured, and that the old woman needed to be brought there immediately. The problem was transportation. The medical jeep was being used for wounded soldiers. Carrying her was possible but risky given her condition. Thompson made a decision that went beyond his orders. He radioed to his commanding officer, Lieutenant Jackson, explaining the situation and requesting permission to transport a civilian to the aid station using their squad's assigned vehicle. The response came back after a brief pause. Permission granted, but make it quick. They had more houses to clear before nightfall. Thompson acknowledged and organized his squad. Williams would drive. Carter would continue house clearing with another squad. Thompson himself would accompany the family to ensure they received proper care. Maria could not comprehend what was happening. This American soldier, this black man she had been taught to fear above all others, was not only helping them, but was going beyond what seemed required. As they walked the 3 streets to the aid station, Thompson carrying Gertrude in his arms because she could no longer walk, Maria tried to understand. She asked, in halting words, why he was doing this. Thompson, breathing heavily from the effort of carrying the elderly woman, replied simply that it was the right thing to do, that his mother was about the same age, that everyone deserved basic decency regardless of which side of a conflict they had been on. At the aid station, a field hospital set up in a former school building, Gertrude was examined by Captain Morris, a physician from Chicago. Morris confirmed Peterson's assessment and administered medication from the captured German supplies. He said that the old woman would likely recover if she received proper nutrition and continued medication, but that she had been within days of a fatal cardiac event. He made arrangements for the family to be placed in a designated civilian care area where Red Cross personnel were beginning to organize aid distribution. Maria was given ration cards, medical documentation, and instructions on where to receive continued assistance. Before Thompson left to return to his duties, Maria stopped him. She needed to say something, though finding the words in her limited emotional state was difficult. She told him, voice breaking, that she was ashamed. Ashamed of what she had believed, ashamed of what she had been taught, ashamed that it took this moment to see the truth. She said that in all the chaos, in all the fear, he was the only one who had helped, the only one who had shown her family kindness when they needed it most. She said she would never forget, that she would tell her daughters about this day, that they would know what real humanity looked like. Thompson, uncomfortable with the attention, simply nodded. He said he hoped her husband would return safely, that her mother would recover fully, and that her daughters would grow up in a better world than the one they were living through now. Then he rejoined his squad and continued the mission. For him, it was one interaction among hundreds during the final weeks of the European conflict. For Maria, it was everything. The immediate aftermath of the occupation brought unexpected changes to Rothenburg. Unlike some towns that had resisted, Rothenburg's open surrender meant minimal destruction and relatively organized transition to American administration. Military government officers established order, civil affairs units began reconstruction efforts, and aid organizations started addressing the humanitarian crisis. Maria and her family were assigned temporary housing in a requisitioned building where multiple families shared space. Food distribution improved steadily as supply lines were established. Medical care became available through military and civilian channels. Life remained difficult, but the immediate threat of starvation and exposure receded. In those early weeks, Maria witnessed transformation across her town. American engineers restored water systems damaged during the conflict's final days. Medical teams vaccinated children against diseases that threatened to spread in crowded conditions. Civil affairs officers organized work programs that gave civilians purpose and income, clearing rubble, repairing infrastructure, and beginning the long process of rebuilding. The occupiers were not the monsters propaganda had promised, but exhausted young men who wanted to complete their assignments and return home. They distributed chocolate to children, shared cigarettes with old men, and showed photographs of their own families to anyone who expressed interest. The humanity of the occupiers made Maria's transformation more painful. She had believed lies about them, and those lies had been designed to make her accept terrible things committed in her nation's name. Maria kept Thompson's field jacket, carefully folded, in their small assigned space. It became a tangible reminder of that April morning, proof that the encounter had been real and not some fever dream born of desperation. She tried to return it through official channels, submitting a request to the military government office, but was told that locating a specific soldier in the chaos of post-conflict reorganization was nearly impossible. Units were being reassigned, personnel rotated, and records were incomplete. The jacket remained with her. As weeks turned to months, Maria began to process what had happened to her worldview. The propaganda she had absorbed was not just wrong about black soldiers, it was wrong about Americans in general, wrong about the nature of the conflict, wrong about what would happen after occupation. The reality she experienced bore little resemblance to what she had been told to expect. Americans, both black and white, treated civilians with general fairness. Food supplies increased rather than decreased. Medical care was provided without discrimination. Children received supplemental nutrition through organized programs. The occupiers were not monsters. They were men, tired and far from home, trying to complete an assignment and return to their lives. But it was Thompson's specific actions that haunted Maria's understanding. She had encountered other American soldiers who were professional and fair. The military government officers were efficient. The medical personnel were skilled. But Thompson had gone beyond professional duty. He had seen a family in crisis and responded with personal compassion, not just official procedure. He had given his own coat, his own food, his own time and effort to help people who, hours earlier, had been officially his enemies. And he had done so while himself being part of a marginalized group within his own military and society. Maria learned, through conversations with other civilians and with American personnel, about the segregation that existed in the United States military. She discovered that black soldiers like Thompson served in separate units, faced discrimination in their own ranks, and returned home to a country where they were treated as second-class citizens, despite their service. This knowledge added another layer to her shame. The man who had helped her, who had shown her family compassion when they needed it most, belonged to a group that faced oppression in his own nation. He had every reason to be bitter, to be harsh, to treat defeated Germans with the same contempt he likely faced regularly. Instead, he had chosen kindness. In June 1945, Maria's husband Klaus returned. He had been captured by Soviet forces in February and held in a temporary prisoner camp before being released as part of mass demobilizations following the German surrender in May. He was thin, exhausted, and psychologically shattered by what he had experienced in the final chaotic months of the conflict. Maria told him about the American sergeant, about the jacket, about how their family had survived those desperate first days of occupation. Klaus listened in silence, then wept. He said he had done things he was ashamed of, followed orders he knew were wrong, participated in a system he had not questioned until it was too late. Hearing that an enemy soldier, a black man who had every reason to be vengeful, had shown his family mercy when German forces had shown so little mercy to others, was almost unbearable. The jacket became a family artifact. As Maria's daughters grew older, she told them the story repeatedly. She made sure they understood not just what Thompson had done, but why it mattered. She explained the propaganda, the lies, the systematic dehumanization that the previous government had promoted. She taught them that judging people by race, nationality, or religion led to catastrophe, that individual character mattered more than any group identity, and that moral courage sometimes meant extending kindness to people society told you to hate. The jacket, worn and faded, hanging in their home, was a physical reminder of these lessons. In 1948, as the American occupation transitioned to German civilian government under Allied oversight, Maria made a concerted effort to find Thompson. She wrote letters to American military authorities, to veterans organizations, to anyone who might have records of the 761st Tank Battalion. The responses were polite but unhelpful. Unit records from 1945 were incomplete. Personnel had scattered across the United States. Tracking individual soldiers was extremely difficult without more specific information. Maria had only a name, rank, and hometown. It was not enough. Years passed, Germany rebuilt, the economic recovery accelerated. Maria and Klaus worked hard to provide for their family, and their daughters grew up in a society that, while still grappling with its recent past, was fundamentally different from the one Maria had known. In 1955, their eldest daughter, Anna, now 17, asked if she could try to find the American sergeant, using her school's new connection to an international student exchange program. Maria agreed, providing all the details she remembered. Anna wrote letters to organizations in Philadelphia, to veterans groups, to anyone who might help locate James Thompson. In October 1955, Maria received a letter. It was from Thompson's sister, writing on his behalf. She explained that James had returned to Philadelphia after the conflict, had found work as a mechanic, and had largely avoided discussing his military service. He had faced discrimination seeking employment despite his honorable record, had struggled with memories of the conflict, and had tried to build a quiet life. But his sister had seen Anna's letter forwarded through a local veterans organization, and she had insisted he respond. Thompson had initially refused, saying that what he had done was nothing special, that any decent person would have helped. His sister had persisted, arguing that Maria had been searching for 10 years and deserved acknowledgement. Thompson's letter was brief. He said he remembered the morning in Rothenburg, that he often thought about whether Maria's family had survived the difficult post-conflict period, and that he was glad to know they were well. He said his actions had required no special courage, that helping people in need was simply being human. He wrote that he hoped Maria and her family had found peace, and that he wished her daughters every success in their lives. The letter was formal, almost awkward, as if he was uncomfortable receiving gratitude for something he considered ordinary decency. Maria wrote back immediately, a longer letter explaining exactly what his actions had meant. She described that April morning in detail, the fear, the desperation, the transformative moment when her expectations collided with reality. She told him about the jacket she still kept, about how she had taught her daughters to judge people by character rather than category, about how his single act of compassion had rippled through her family's understanding of the world. She thanked him not just for the immediate help, but for demonstrating that humanity could persist even in circumstances designed to destroy it. A correspondence developed, infrequent but meaningful. Thompson shared aspects of his life he rarely discussed with others. He wrote about the discrimination he had faced returning home, about battles his unit had fought that received no recognition, about fellow soldiers who had not survived the conflict. He wrote about the strange experience of fighting for a country that did not fully accept him, of liberating people who had been taught to despise him, of trying to maintain dignity in circumstances that denied it. Maria responded with her own reflections on guilt, responsibility, and the long process of confronting what her nation had done. In 1961, an unexpected opportunity arose. A German-American friendship organization was sponsoring visits between German families and American veterans who had served in the occupation forces. Maria applied and was accepted. In September 1961, she traveled to Philadelphia with her husband Klaus and their younger daughter. It was the first time any of them had left Germany. The trip was overwhelming. The scale of American cities, the abundance in stores, the diversity of people. And then, in a small house in a working-class neighborhood, Maria met James Thompson face to face for the first time in 16 years. Thompson was now 44, with gray beginning to show in his hair. He lived modestly, worked long hours, and had never married. When he opened the door and saw Maria, there was a moment of mutual recognition that transcended the years. They embraced, both crying, while Thompson's sister and Maria's family looked on. For hours they talked, filling in details from letters, sharing photographs, discussing how the world had changed and how it had stayed the same. Thompson showed them Philadelphia, introduced them to his community, and demonstrated a life built through persistent dignity in the face of ongoing obstacles. Klaus asked Thompson a question that had haunted him for years. He asked how Thompson had maintained compassion toward Germans, toward people whose government had promoted racism as official policy. When Thompson himself faced racism in his own country, how did he extend humanity to enemies when his own nation denied him full humanity? Thompson was quiet for a long time before answering. He said that he had two choices in life. He could become bitter and treat others as he had been treated, perpetuating cycles of hatred, or he could be the person he wished others would be, demonstrating the behavior he wanted to see in the world. He said that Maria's family in that cellar had not personally wronged him, that the little girls who needed food were not responsible for propaganda, that an elderly woman requiring medication was simply a human being in need. He said that answering injustice with more injustice solved nothing, that the only way forward was to treat each person as an individual deserving of basic decency until they personally proved otherwise. Maria told Thompson that his simple act of kindness had changed not just her life, but her understanding of what was possible. She said that in the years since, whenever she faced choices about how to treat others, she thought about that April morning and asked herself what he would have done. She said that the jacket hanging in her home was not just a piece of fabric, but a reminder that individual choices mattered, that personal integrity could survive systemic corruption, and that moral courage sometimes looked like offering your coat to someone who needed warmth. Thompson remained uncomfortable with being held as any kind of moral exemplar. He insisted repeatedly that he had simply done what any decent person would do, that his actions required no special virtue. But Maria argued that this was precisely the point. Decency should be ordinary, but circumstances had made it extraordinary. In a system designed to dehumanize, in a conflict that encouraged viewing enemies as abstractions, in a moment when revenge would have been understandable, he had chosen to see individual human beings and respond to their needs. That choice, replicated across millions of similar moments by thousands of individuals, was how societies rebuilt trust and moved beyond conflict. The week Maria spent in Philadelphia opened her eyes to another dimension of Thompson's story. She met other black veterans who shared experiences of serving with distinction overseas, only to return home to segregation, discrimination, and denial of benefits. She learned about the specific challenges Thompson's unit had faced, the constant need to prove themselves worthy of respect. The battles fought not just against military enemies, but against prejudice within their own forces. She understood that Thompson's kindness to her family had not come from a place of privilege or comfort, but from someone who himself faced daily indignity, yet chose not to pass that pain forward. She also met Thompson's friends and community members, people who described him as quiet, hard-working, and deeply private about his military service. They said he never sought recognition, never told war stories, never claimed special status for his service. He went to work, helped neighbors when needed, and tried to live peacefully. Maria realized that Thompson represented thousands of men whose contributions would be forgotten because they lacked the platform, the connections, or the recognition that history granted to others. His story mattered not because it was unique, but because it was representative of countless unrecorded acts of decency performed by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. When Maria returned to Germany, she brought back not just renewed gratitude, but a sense of mission. She became active in German-American friendship societies, in organizations promoting reconciliation, and in educational programs addressing the previous government's crimes. She spoke to school groups, sharing her story as a counter-narrative to both German nationalist revisionism and simplistic Allied triumphalism. She emphasized that the post-conflict period had been characterized not by vengeance, but by remarkable acts of mercy, that occupying forces had generally treated defeated civilians humanely, and that individuals on all sides had made choices that transcended national and racial divisions. Her daughters absorbed these lessons deeply. Anna became a teacher, focusing on history education and critical thinking about propaganda. Her younger daughter, Lotte, became a social worker, dedicating her career to helping displaced persons and refugees. Both credited their mother's experience and Thompson's example as foundational to their understanding of human dignity and responsibility. The jacket, carefully preserved now, passed to Anna, who eventually donated it to a museum dedicated to German-American relations. where it was displayed with Maria's written account of that April morning. Thompson and Maria maintained their correspondence until Thompson's passing in 1983 at age 66. His death, from heart disease exacerbated by a lifetime of stress and inadequate medical care, was noted in a small obituary in the Philadelphia Inquirer that mentioned his military service in one sentence. Maria learned of his death 3 weeks later through his sister. She traveled to Philadelphia again, now elderly herself, to attend a memorial service attended by a few dozen people. She spoke to the gathered community about what James Thompson had meant to her family, about how a single act of compassion had rippled across decades and an ocean, about how his example had shaped her understanding of what it meant to be human in inhumane circumstances. Thompson's sister gave Maria a small box of items that James had kept from his military service. Among them was a worn photograph of Thompson in uniform, several letters from fellow soldiers, and a brief diary entry from April 21, 1945. The entry read simply, "Cleared houses on Hauptstrasse today. Found a family in bad shape in a cellar. Got them to the aid station. The old woman should make it if she gets her medicine. Just routine work, weather cold." For Thompson, helping Maria's family had been routine work, a minor incident in a day full of tasks. For Maria, it had been life-altering. This contrast between the ordinariness Thompson attributed to his actions and the profound impact they had on the recipient encapsulated something essential about moral courage. Often the most important acts are those performed without expectation of recognition, driven simply by internal standards of decency rather than external reward. In the following years, as Maria herself aged, she continued telling the story to anyone who would listen. She spoke at schools, community centers, and historical societies. She gave interviews to researchers studying the post-conflict occupation period. She contributed to oral history projects documenting civilian experiences during the conflict's end. Always her message was the same. Prejudice and propaganda could be overcome by direct human contact. Individual choices mattered even in systemic injustice. The courage to extend compassion to supposed enemies was the foundation of peace. And that judgment based on race, nationality, or any group characteristic was not just morally wrong but practically catastrophic. Maria Hoffman passed away in 1995 at age 82. Her obituary, published in her local newspaper, mentioned her advocacy for reconciliation and her role in German-American friendship organizations. But to her family, her legacy was more personal. It was the jacket, preserved as a family heirloom. It was the story, told and retold across 3 generations. It was the example of how encountering evidence that contradicted prejudice could transform understanding. It was the demonstration that human decency could persist in circumstances designed to destroy it. It was the lesson that the question is never what category someone belongs to, but what they choose to do when confronted with another person's need. The 761st Tank Battalion, Thompson's unit, was finally recognized officially decades after the conflict ended. In 2003, the unit received a Presidential Unit Citation for their actions supporting infantry operations in France and Germany. By that time, most of the original members had passed away. The recognition came too late for Thompson to receive it personally, but his sister attended the ceremony in Washington and accepted commemoration on his behalf. She brought Maria's letters with her, evidence of impact that transcended military records and official histories. The letters demonstrated what statistics and battle reports could not, that individual soldiers had made individual choices that affected individual lives in profound and lasting ways. Today, the jacket Thompson gave to Maria's mother resides in a small museum in Germany dedicated to civilian experiences during the final phase of the conflict and subsequent occupation. It is displayed alongside Maria's written account, photographs of her family, copies of correspondence between Maria and Thompson, and educational materials explaining both the immediate context of April 1945 and the broader historical circumstances of racial segregation in the United States military. The exhibit asks visitors to consider questions about propaganda, prejudice, and the power of personal experience to challenge learned beliefs. It emphasizes that Thompson's actions were simultaneously ordinary and extraordinary, ordinary in their basic human decency, extraordinary in their context and impact. Historical analysis of the occupation period confirms that interactions like the one between Thompson and Maria were more common than Cold War narratives sometimes acknowledged. American forces, despite systemic racism within their ranks and broader society, generally treated German civilians according to established protocols that emphasized humanitarian concerns. Aid was distributed, medical care provided, and reconstruction supported, not primarily from altruism, but from a combination of strategic interest in stabilizing the region, genuine humanitarian concern among individual soldiers and administrators, and military discipline that enforced proper conduct. Yet within this broader pattern, individual stories like Maria's reveal the human dimension that statistics cannot capture, the moment when one person chose to go beyond minimum requirements to address another person's suffering. Thompson's experience was representative of approximately 1 million black soldiers who served in the American military during the conflict, most in segregated units, many in support roles, and few receiving proportional recognition for their contributions. The 761st Tank Battalion was among the few black armored units that saw extensive combat action. These soldiers fought not just military enemies, but also persistent discrimination, proving themselves repeatedly in circumstances where their competence was constantly questioned. Many returned home to find that their service earned them little respect or opportunity in a still segregated society. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s would eventually challenge these structures, but for Thompson's generation, change came slowly, if at all. Maria's transformation from fear to understanding to advocacy illustrates a broader pattern in post-conflict Germany. Many Germans underwent similar reckonings when propaganda collided with reality. When expected, monsters proved to be ordinary humans, when promised catastrophe was replaced by structured reconstruction. This cognitive dissonance was not comfortable. It required acknowledging complicity, confronting lies, and rebuilding identity on different foundations. Some Germans refused this process, clinging to old beliefs. But many, like Maria, embraced the difficult work of re-examination and change. These individual transformations, aggregated across millions of people, enabled Germany's eventual reconciliation with its past and integration into the international community. The relationship between Maria and Thompson also demonstrates how personal connections can transcend historical enmity. Their correspondence, spanning decades and an ocean, showed two people from vastly different backgrounds finding common ground in shared humanity. Thompson, facing racism in America, and Maria, confronting Germany's crimes, each grappled with collective guilt and individual responsibility. Their friendship was not about forgetting history or excusing injustice, but about maintaining faith in the possibility of human decency, even in societies that failed to fully embody it. They demonstrated that reconciliation happens not primarily through governmental treaties or official apologies, though these matter, but through countless small acts of recognition, respect, and relationship, building between individuals. Today, scholars studying the occupation period point to stories like Maria's as evidence of complex realities that simple narratives miss. The post-conflict era was neither purely vengeful nor purely magnanimous. It was characterized by mixture, by policies that ranged from punitive to supportive, by individual actors who made choices ranging from cruel to compassionate, and by outcomes that varied dramatically depending on specific circumstances. Thompson's decision to help Maria's family was one data point among millions, but it mattered profoundly to the people involved and illustrated possibilities that policy frameworks alone could not create. The jacket itself, now behind museum glass, represents more than one soldier's generosity. It symbolizes the gap between propaganda and reality, the power of direct human contact to challenge prejudice, the ripple effects of individual moral choices, and the complicated process of rebuilding trust after conflict. Visitors who see it are encouraged to reflect on their own beliefs, to question what they assume about people from different backgrounds, and to consider what small acts of kindness might mean to someone in crisis. The exhibit asks not whether viewers would have done what Thompson did, but whether they do equivalent things in their own contexts, whether they extend compassion across lines of difference, whether they maintain decency in circumstances that discourage it. Maria Hoffman's story is ultimately about transformation through encounter. She began April 21st, 1945, with a worldview shaped by years of propaganda, convinced that Black American soldiers represented the greatest threat to her family's safety. She ended that day having experienced the opposite, having received life-saving help from the very person she had been taught to fear most. This cognitive dissonance forced a profound re-evaluation of everything she had been told, not just about race, but about nationality, about conflict, about human nature itself. The process was uncomfortable, shameful even, but ultimately liberating. It freed her from prejudices that had distorted her understanding and allowed her to see people as individuals rather than categories. Thompson's story is about maintaining integrity under pressure. He served in a segregated military representing a country that denied him full citizenship. He fought in a conflict against an enemy whose defining characteristic was racial ideology, while himself facing racial discrimination. He returned home to find limited opportunities despite his honorable service. Yet throughout, he maintained his sense of what was right, helping when he could, treating people with basic decency, refusing to let injustice he experienced become justification for injustice he inflicted. His was not the dramatic heroism of battlefield valor, though the 761st saw plenty of action, but the quiet heroism of daily moral choices, of extending compassion when bitterness would have been understandable, of seeing individuals when categories would have been easier. The broader historical context makes their encounter more remarkable. April 1945 was near the absolute end of the European conflict, just days before the final German surrender. Germany was defeated, occupied, its cities destroyed, its economy collapsed, its population traumatized. The American forces were tired, having fought across France and into Germany for almost a year since the Normandy landings. Tension was high. The recent discovery of concentration camps had shocked Allied soldiers and hardened attitudes toward Germans. In this context, Thompson's decision to go beyond minimum requirements, to provide personal items, to ensure proper care, represented a conscious choice to see past collective guilt to individual need. Maria's daughters, growing up in post-conflict Germany, inherited their mother's transformed worldview. They came of age in a society undergoing profound changes, grappling with recent history, rebuilding physically and morally. Their mother's story gave them a framework for understanding these changes, a personal narrative that illustrated abstract concepts of reconciliation and human dignity. Anna's choice to become a history teacher and Lotta's decision to work with refugees directly stemmed from lessons learned through their mother's experience. The impact of Thompson's act rippled not just through Maria's life, but through subsequent generations, shaping how they understood their responsibilities to others. The eventual meeting in Philadelphia in 1961 provided closure neither person knew they needed. For Maria, it confirmed that Thompson had thrived despite obstacles, that his kindness had not been an isolated incident, but reflected his character, and that their encounter had meant something to him as well, even if he downplayed its significance. For Thompson, it demonstrated that his actions had lasting impact, that what he considered ordinary decency had been life-altering for someone else, and that connection could transcend the vast differences in their experiences and circumstances. Their friendship, maintained through letters and occasional visits, became a living example of the principles they both valued. The jacket's journey from practical military gear to museum artifact traces the transformation of memory into history. For 16 years, it was a personal possession, a tangible reminder of a specific morning. Then it became a symbol Maria used in her advocacy, a prop in telling her story to skeptical audiences who needed physical evidence to believe the encounter had occurred. Finally, it became a historical object, placed in context with documentation and analysis, serving educational purposes for people who had no direct connection to the events it represented. This progression reflects how personal memory becomes collective understanding, how individual experiences are preserved and interpreted for broader lessons. Thompson's reluctance to accept recognition for his actions reveals something important about moral behavior. He genuinely believed he had done nothing special, that any decent person would have helped a family in crisis. This belief was both humble and profound. Humble because it refused to claim special virtue for basic humanity. Profound because it assumed decency should be the default, that helping others should not require exceptional courage, but should be ordinary behavior. His discomfort with Maria's gratitude stemmed from a conviction that the world should work this way, that people should routinely extend compassion across lines of difference, and that what he did was only remarkable because circumstances made basic decency difficult. The historical record shows that Thompson's attitude was not unique. Many soldiers from all participating nations performed acts of kindness that went unrecorded and unrecognized. They shared rations with hungry civilians, protected vulnerable people from harm, went beyond orders to address human suffering. These actions did not make headlines or earn medals, but they mattered profoundly to the recipients and demonstrated that even in circumstances designed to dehumanize, individual humanity persisted. Thompson's story is significant not because it is unique, but because it was documented and preserved, giving us insight into countless similar encounters that left no record. The contrast between Thompson's treatment of Maria's family and the broader patterns of racial injustice in American society highlights contradictions that would eventually fuel the civil rights movement. Black soldiers like Thompson fought for American values of freedom and equality abroad while being denied full freedom and equality at home. They liberated European cities while their own families in the United States faced segregation and discrimination. This disconnect became increasingly untenable as veterans returned home with broader perspectives and less willingness to accept second-class citizenship after having risked their lives in military service. Thompson's generation laid groundwork for changes their children would demand. Maria's advocacy work in later decades shows how personal transformation can become public action. She did not keep her experience private, but used it as a tool for education, sharing her story to challenge both German reluctance to confront recent history and simplistic narratives about the conflict and its aftermath. She emphasized complexity, the reality that people were both products of their societies and individual moral agents, that understanding context did not excuse behavior, but helped explain it, and that moving forward required acknowledging both collective responsibility and individual variation. Her message was nuanced in ways that simple condemnation or simple forgiveness were not. The museum exhibit featuring the jacket includes testimonies from other German civilians who had similar experiences with Black American soldiers, suggesting that Thompson's behavior was part of a broader pattern. These testimonies describe instances of protection from harassment, provision of food and medical care, and simple human kindness extended to people who had been conditioned to fear exactly such encounters. Collectively, these accounts challenge both wartime propaganda that demonized black soldiers and post-conflict narratives that focused exclusively on military achievements while ignoring humanitarian actions. They restore human dimension to events often described in purely strategic or political terms. Thompson's unit, the 761st Tank Battalion, compiled a distinguished record that was largely ignored for decades. They supported the 103rd Infantry Division through France, participated in operations in the Vosges Mountains, supported advances through the Siegfried Line, and helped liberate dozens of towns in southern Germany. Their after-action reports documented effective performance under difficult conditions, but systemic racism meant their achievements received minimal recognition compared to white units with similar records. The eventual presidential unit citation in 2003 came too late for most members, but acknowledged historical injustice and corrected the record, at least partially. The educational programs that developed around Maria's story emphasized that challenging prejudice requires direct counter-experience. Maria did not change her views through abstract argument or moral reasoning alone. She changed because reality directly contradicted her learned beliefs, because the person she encountered did not match the category assigned to him, and because his behavior demonstrated the falseness of propaganda she had accepted. This process, uncomfortable and shameful as it was, proved more effective than any lecture or lesson could have been. Educators use her example to discuss how prejudice functions and how it can be overcome, emphasizing the importance of diverse contact and willingness to revise beliefs when evidence demands it. The correspondence between Maria and Thompson, preserved in archives, reveals the development of genuine friendship across vast differences in experience and circumstance. They wrote about daily life, about family, about struggles and hopes. Thompson described challenges finding employment, ongoing discrimination, and efforts to maintain dignity in frustrating circumstances. Maria wrote about Germany's reconstruction, about her daughter's education, and about her own process of confronting personal and collective guilt. Neither sugar-coated reality or offered false comfort, but both maintained respect and caring that transcended their differences. Their friendship modeled possibility for broader reconciliation. The jacket also serves as a reminder that material objects carry meaning beyond their physical properties. It was standard military issue, nothing special in itself, produced in one of thousands of factories supporting the American military effort, distributed to one of millions of soldiers. Yet this particular jacket, given in a specific moment to address a specific need, became laden with significance that far exceeded its utilitarian function. It represented transformation, connection, and the power of individual choice to shape meaning even in circumstances that seemed determined by forces beyond personal control. Its preservation and display honor not just Thompson and Maria, but the principle that individual actions matter. The museum where the jacket is displayed also addresses broader themes of propaganda, occupation policy, and the complex process of post-conflict reconstruction. Visitors learn about the systematic indoctrination German civilians underwent, the challenges Allied forces faced administering defeated territories, and the various strategies employed to denazify and democratize German society. Maria's story fits within this larger context, illustrating how official policies played out in individual lives, how abstract principles translated into concrete experiences, and how the success or failure of reconstruction efforts often depended on countless small interactions between former enemies learning to live in shared space. Thompson's decision to give his jacket created a small ripple that eventually became a wave, reaching far beyond that April morning. Maria told her daughters, who told their children. She spoke to school groups, influencing hundreds of students. She contributed to historical projects that reached thousands of readers. The museum exhibit is seen by tens of thousands of visitors. Thompson's single act, performed without expectation of recognition or reward, ultimately touched countless lives and contributed to understanding about prejudice, propaganda, and human possibility. This multiplication of impact illustrates how individual moral choices, however small they seem at the time, can have consequences far beyond immediate circumstances. The story also raises questions about recognition and memory. Thompson died with minimal acknowledgement, his obituary barely noting his military service. His contributions largely forgotten outside his immediate community. Only through Maria's persistence and documentation did his story survive. How many similar stories were lost because recipients did not document them, because soldiers never returned home to tell their experiences, because prejudice and discrimination meant certain contributions were systematically overlooked. The historical record is incomplete, shaped by who had power to document and whose stories were deemed worth preserving. Recovering stories like Thompson's helps correct these omissions and provides fuller understanding of historical reality. Maria's initial fear and Thompson's subsequent kindness were both products of their contexts. Maria had been systematically taught to fear, exposed to years of propaganda designed to dehumanize certain groups. Her beliefs were not innate but learned, cultivated by a regime that used racial hatred as a political tool. Thompson's compassion was also shaped by context, by family values, by community expectations, by religious faith, and perhaps by his own experience of being judged by category rather than character. Neither acted in a vacuum. Both were embedded in societies that shaped their possibilities and responses. Yet within these constraints, both made choices that transcended determined outcomes, demonstrating that human agency persists even in circumstances that severely limit it. The jacket's preservation reflects a deliberate choice to maintain connection to difficult history, rather than forget and move on. Germany's approach to its recent past has been characterized by sustained engagement rather than avoidance, by memorialization rather than erasure, by education rather than silence. This choice, controversial and uncomfortable, has arguably enabled Germany to integrate its history in ways that support rather than undermine democratic stability. Maria's story and artifacts like the jacket contribute to this ongoing process by personalizing abstract history, by showing how ideas and policies affected real people, and by demonstrating both the worst and best of human possibility. Thompson's service and subsequent treatment illustrate contradictions at the heart of American identity. The United States fought against racial ideology abroad while maintaining racial segregation at home, proclaimed universal values while denying them to portions of its population, and celebrated freedom while restricting it along racial lines. These contradictions, visible to people like Thompson, who experienced them directly, eventually became unsustainable. The civil rights movement drew on military service as one argument for full citizenship, pointing out that men who risked their lives defending their country deserved full rights within it. Thompson's story is part of this larger narrative of struggle, progress, and ongoing effort to align American reality with American ideals. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.